in her sister-in-law Nina's house, surrounded by family for another typical monthly brunch. However, this time, something was different. Her husband, James, with an oddly forced smile, handed her a cup of coffee, saying, "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" The smell hit her almost immediately, a strange metallic scent that made her stomach twist in discomfort. Christina, at 29 years old, never imagined she would find herself questioning the intentions of her own husband. But after years of strange illnesses that seemed to happen every time she was around him and Nina, the doubts began to surface. The coffee that James had handed her wasn't the first odd occurrence. There had been many before. She recalled the time she had spent in urgent care after drinking tea at Nina's house, only for Nina to insist that she had made it exactly the same way she made her own. And yet, the doctors could never explain what had happened to Christina's body. Her suspicions had been growing over the years. James had become more distant, and the subtle whispers between him and Nina never seemed to stop when she walked into the room. Something was happening, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Today, however, she wasn't just going to sit and wait for whatever might happen. Something in her gut told her this time would be different. Christina's mind raced as she studied the cup in front of her. Could this be another setup? Or was her instinct wrong this time? She had to find out. She had no other choice but to act, even if she didn't know what the consequences might be. Christina couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For months, she had felt like she was walking in a fog, constantly battling strange, unexplained symptoms after every meal at Nina's house or family gatherings. At first, it seemed like coincidences. A little upset stomach here, a slight allergic reaction there. But after it kept happening, she started paying closer attention. There had been the time she got so dizzy after dinner that she couldn't stand. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong, and James quickly blamed it on something unrelated, perhaps something she ate earlier that day. But then there were the other strange incidents. Christina began noticing patterns. Whenever she had a meal at Nina's house, she would feel increasingly ill. It wasn't just the food that made her feel sick, it was the after effects. Every time, without fail, she ended up feeling exhausted, weak, and nauseous. Nina, of course, was always present, acting as though nothing was out of the ordinary, always offering some excuse or explanation for what happened. The most telling incident was the time Christina had ended up in urgent care after a meal prepared by Nina. She couldn't remember exactly what she had eaten, but the symptoms had been severe. Her stomach churned and she felt dizzy for hours. The doctors didn't know what caused it, and yet Nina insisted that she had made the meal exactly the same way she made it for herself. It was as though Nina was trying to convince everyone, and maybe even herself, that it was just bad luck. But Christina wasn't convinced anymore. James, on the other hand, seemed to always have a quick explanation ready. "Maybe you're just coming down with something," he would say. But after the third or fourth visit to the hospital, Christina started to see the pattern more clearly. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just her. The pieces started to fit together. The strange food, the odd symptoms, and the way Nina and James always seemed to be present, always offering help or a new meal to share. But Christina wasn't sure what to do with the information she had. How could she accuse her husband of something so terrible? Was she just being paranoid? She had no hard proof, nothing concrete, but she couldn't ignore the feeling deep down that something was horribly wrong. As she sat there at Nina's table with a cup of coffee in front of her, the same dread washed over her. Her stomach twisted, and she instinctively held the cup in her hand, pretending to take a sip while carefully watching Nina and James from the corner of her eye. This time, she couldn't back down. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it might cost. As Christina continued to reflect on the series of events, her mind started to piece together a troubling pattern. Over the past year, she had been to the hospital multiple times for various inexplicable symptoms. Each time, she left with no real answers. Doctors would run tests, find nothing, and chalk it up to a minor illness or some random food allergy. But Christina knew deep down that this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. She had become increasingly suspicious of what was really going on. Every time she ate at Nina's house, or even at home with James, her symptoms would flare up. What was particularly alarming was how the incident started to escalate. What once seemed like small stomach issues now turned into more serious reactions. She would feel dizzy, weak, and nauseous, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Her energy would drain completely, and it was as if her body was shutting down. At first, she tried to dismiss it as just a random occurrence. But after the third or fourth time it happened, the pattern became undeniable. Christina started to pay closer attention to everything around her. She began noticing how often she would get sick after meals that were either prepared by James or Nina, or after she had drinks with them. It was subtle at first, small things like extra seasoning in the food or a drink that made her feel lightheaded right after she finished it. She had never experienced reactions like this before her marriage, but it was impossible to ignore the coincidences anymore. The worst incident had happened 2 months ago, when Christina was rushed to the hospital after a breakfast at Nina's house. Her stomach pains were unbearable, and the dizziness made it hard for her to even stand. The doctors found traces of something in her system, but they couldn't identify it. There were no clear answers, and once again James quickly brushed it off. "It must have been something you ate," he said, offering a comforting smile as if that was enough to explain everything. But Christina was no longer convinced. This was more than just bad luck or a random series of events. There was a pattern to the sickness. She started keeping track, log after log, of meals, drinks, and symptoms. And with each new entry, the realization became clearer. Nina and James were somehow involved in this. The more she thought about it, the more she realized they were always there when it happened. Whether it was James cooking dinner or Nina offering her a drink, the symptoms would always follow. She knew in her gut that they were behind it, but she had no concrete proof. It was in that moment, sitting at Nina's dining table, that Christina made the decision. She couldn't ignore her instincts anymore. She had to get to the bottom of this, even if it meant confronting the people she loved most. This wasn't just about a stomach ache. It was about her health, her life, and most importantly, her future. Christina's mind raced as she stared down at the cup of coffee James had made for her. The strange metallic smell, the way he looked at her with that forced smile, and the way Nina had emphasized that it was made just for her all seemed too orchestrated to be accidental. She had to know if this was yet another attempt to make her sick. She had to act now. The tension in the room was palpable as Christina stared at the cup of coffee in front of her. Her mind raced with suspicion, but she remained calm on the outside. James, ever the attentive husband, sat across from her with an unnerving smile. "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" His words were too sweet, too deliberate. Christina forced a smile, pretending to be pleased. But every instinct inside her screamed that something was wrong. The coffee had a strange, metallic smell, something she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just the aroma. It was a combination of the smell, the way James was looking at her, and the unsettling presence of Nina, who sat nearby, stirring her own coffee absently. It all felt orchestrated. Christina's stomach twisted as she lifted the cup to her lips. The smell was overpowering, and she hesitated for a moment. Something told her not to drink it. But she didn't want to raise suspicion, especially in front of Nina, who was watching her with an odd, knowing expression. Nina had always been a little too interested in the details of Christina's life, her meals, her activities, and her health. And now, with James by her side, Christina couldn't shake the feeling that they were both involved in something far darker than she had ever imagined. Nina leaned forward and added in her usual casual manner, "James has become quite the barista lately. He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The emphasis she placed on "just for you" sent a chill down Christina's spine. Why did Nina sound so smug? And why did James seem so proud? It was as if they were in on some secret and Christina was the last to know. The words felt loaded, as if they were somehow taunting her, daring her to question their intentions. Christina forced herself to take a sip, even though every fiber of her being told her not to. She needed to be sure. As the coffee touched her lips, she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to find out if this was another attempt to poison her, another part of the sick plan they had been slowly setting into motion for months. But this time, she wasn't going to wait around and fall victim to whatever they had in store. She suddenly stood up, pretending to get a call for work. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick call. Nina, would you mind if I use your study?" she asked, trying to seem nonchalant while her mind raced. She barely waited for Nina's response before she quickly walked away from the table, her heart beating faster with every step. But as she walked past Nina's place setting, she deliberately stumbled, causing the coffee cups to jostle. In the confusion, she quickly swapped her cup with Nina's. She felt a brief sense of relief, knowing that she had just changed the course of the game. She apologized with a forced smile, making sure Nina wasn't paying too much attention. "I'm such a klutz sometimes," she said, as if to brush off the awkward moment. Nina waved her off, a tight smile on her face, and told her to be careful not to break anything in the study. Christina made her way to the study, trying to steady her breathing. She could still see James and Nina at the table through the doorway. Her heart raced as she tried to appear calm while secretly watching them. She had to know what would happen next. Would Nina drink from the cup she had just swapped, or would they catch on to what Christina had done? Her mind was spinning with questions, but all she could do now was wait and watch. A few moments later, she saw Nina pick up the coffee cup, the one Christina had just switched, and take a sip. Christina's stomach churned as she observed Nina's reaction. This was it. She had to find out the truth. Christina's heart skipped a beat as she watched Nina take a sip of the coffee from the swapped cup. Her pulse quickened as she observed Nina's reaction. At first, everything seemed normal, but within seconds, Nina's face shifted from calm to confusion. Her eyes widened and her hand began to tremble. Christina's stomach twisted in anticipation. She had been waiting for this moment, yet nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Nina set the cup down with a shaking hand, staring at it as if it held some kind of answer she couldn't comprehend. The color drained from her face and she looked up at James, her voice filled with panic. "James, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her hands, once steady, now shook violently as she clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. James, who had been typing on his phone, looked up with alarm as he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. He immediately stood up, knocking over his chair in his haste. "Nina, what's happening?" he asked, his voice thick with panic. Nina didn't respond at first. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled and she collapsed back into her chair, still clutching her stomach. "James," she gasped again, her voice weak. "What did you put in that coffee?" Christina's breath caught in her throat as everything started to click into place. The coffee. Nina had drunk from the wrong cup. The strange metallic smell, the way James had been acting so oddly, everything Christina had been suspicious of was suddenly laid bare. This wasn't just a random incident. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. They had planned it. For a moment, Christina felt a sense of relief, knowing that she had finally uncovered the truth. But as Nina's body continued to tremble, the gravity of the situation hit her. She had suspected all along that James and Nina were behind the sicknesses that had plagued her for so long, but now she had confirmation. The plan to poison her had failed. Instead, it had backfired spectacularly on Nina. Christina's mind raced with questions. How long had they been planning this? How far had they gone? But right now, she knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let this moment slip away. With her heart pounding, she rushed to the study and grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with steady hands. "My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee," Christina said calmly, despite the chaos unfolding in the next room. "She's conscious but experiencing violent tremors. Please send an ambulance." The dispatcher's voice on the other end was clear and reassuring as Christina kept her phone recording. The truth was finally coming out as Christina remained on the phone with 9911. She watched from the study doorway, her heart racing as Nina's condition worsened. Nina's body was racked with violent tremors, and her once composed demeanor was now replaced with raw panic. She clutched her stomach and tried to steady herself, but it was clear she was fading fast. James stood frozen, staring at his sister with wide, terrified eyes. His hands trembled as he reached for her, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. This was no longer just an unfortunate incident. Nina's voice, weak and strained, cut through the tension. "James, you promised. You said it wouldn't be this bad." Her words were barely audible, but Christina caught every one. They were words of desperation and regret. The same words someone might say when realizing their plan had failed. And for the first time, Christina saw Nina's true self, vulnerable, fearful, and broken. As Nina continued to shake uncontrollably, her gaze suddenly turned to Christina. "You knew?" Nina whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "You knew what we were doing?" The realization hit Christina like a ton of bricks. Nina wasn't just frightened for herself. She was terrified because the truth had finally come out. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," Nina continued, her voice now tinged with anger. We just wanted you out of the way. You were stealing everything from me, every client, every opportunity. You were doing better than me. James and I, we thought if we could make you sick enough, make you unreliable, you'd miss the presentation. The Henderson account, it would be mine." Christina's stomach turned as Nina's words sank in. This wasn't just about a few bad meals or accidents. It was about jealousy, competition, and greed. Nina had been working with James to sabotage her career for months, poisoning her slowly, trying to undermine her success. James stood silent, his face pale and his shoulders slumped in defeat. He finally opened his mouth, but his words were weak. "Nina, stop. You don't know what you're saying." His voice trembled, and his facade of calm was completely gone. Christina felt a strange calmness take over as she listened to Nina's confession. The truth was finally out. The web of lies they had spun around her was unraveling before her eyes. This wasn't just an accident or a series of unfortunate events. It was deliberate. They had been planning this for months, and now it was all crashing down. With a steady voice, Christina turned to Nina and said, "You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." As Christina watched Nina's trembling form, she realized the power of the truth. It had taken her so long to reach this point, but now she knew exactly what had been happening all along. The chaos that ensued in Nina's living room was palpable. As Nina's body continued to tremble uncontrollably, the realization of the depth of the betrayal Christina had experienced settled into her mind. Her heart was still racing, but her resolve was unwavering. She was no longer just a victim of strange illnesses and unexplained accidents. She was now a witness to the true face of her family's deception. Christina felt a surge of anger, but she pushed it down, focusing on the next step. She had to make sure that Nina's confession was recorded. Her phone was still in her hand, the recording feature still running, capturing every word. The truth was out, and now it had to be documented. It was clear that Nina and James had been poisoning her for months, trying to ruin her career and make her sick, and now they had inadvertently exposed themselves. "Christina," James finally spoke up, his voice cracking as he looked at her with wide, pleading eyes. "Please. You have to understand, we were trying to protect you. You were working too hard, taking on too many clients. We just wanted you to slow down." Christina's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. She couldn't believe the audacity. "Protect me?" she repeated, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly with rage. "By poisoning me? That's not protection. That's manipulation. That's attempted murder." James looked stunned, his face paling as the weight of her words sank in. He tried to move toward her, but she stepped back. "Stay away from me, James," she warned. Her voice was firm, the power in her words cutting through the panic in his eyes. Just then, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching. The emergency responders were finally on their way. Christina glanced at the door, her stomach still tight with anxiety, but a sense of calm washed over her. The situation was about to be taken out of her hands, and for the first time in months, she would be free from the toxic web that James and Nina had woven around her. Christina quickly turned to Nina, who had now slumped in her chair, looking defeated and terrified. Nina's face was pale, her breath shallow. "I'm sorry. I didn't want it to go this far," Nina whispered, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to take you down. You were always in my way." Christina shook her head. "This was never about me. This was about your own insecurities, your jealousy, but it's over now. You can't hurt me anymore." As the paramedics rushed into the room, Christina stepped aside, giving them space to tend to Nina. She continued to record the entire exchange, capturing every confession and every word that might later be used as evidence. James stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as though trying to form words, but nothing came out. He knew the game was up. Christina's heart pounded as she watched the paramedics work. She couldn't believe how far they had gone, how much they had plotted to destroy her. But now, it was all coming to an end. The truth was finally coming out. Before she left for the hospital with the paramedics, Christina made sure to send the recording to her lawyer. This was no longer just a family issue, it was a legal matter now. She needed to ensure that she had everything in place, that there would be consequences for what James and Nina had done. As Christina sat in the waiting room of the hospital, her mind was still racing, but her heart was beginning to settle. The paramedics had rushed Nina to the emergency room, and now Christina was left to process what had just unfolded. The past few months felt like a blur. Each hospital visit, each unexplained illness, the nagging feeling in her gut that something wasn't right. Now, it was all so clear. James hadn't followed her to the hospital. He had mumbled something about parking the car, but it had been over 20 minutes and he still hadn't shown up. Christina knew that it wasn't just a coincidence. He was avoiding facing the consequences of his actions. He was terrified of what was coming next, and rightly so. As she waited, Christina pulled out her phone again. She reviewed the recording she had sent to her lawyer and listened to Nina's confession once more. Hearing Nina's voice, shaky and filled with regret, reminded Christina of how far these people had gone to ruin her life. They had worked together for months to poison her, both figuratively and literally, but now the truth was out. The damage they had tried to inflict on her was being undone, and Christina was taking back control of her life. A nurse walked into the waiting room, and Christina stood up, her breath catching in her throat. "Mrs. Bennett," the nurse called. Christina nodded, and the nurse gestured for her to follow. "The doctor will speak with you about your sister-in-law's condition," she said. Christina followed the nurse down the hallway, her mind still focused on what had happened. She knew that Nina's situation wasn't over. The doctors had told her that Nina was stabilized for now, but the toxins in her system were alarming. It was clear that they had been poisoning her for months, and Nina's body was reacting violently to the high levels of toxins she had ingested. When they arrived at Nina's room, Dr. Phillips was there, waiting for Christina. The doctor's expression was grave, and Christina felt a chill run down her spine. "Mrs. Bennett?" Dr. Phillips said. "The substances we found in your sister-in-law's blood are extremely concerning. These are not substances that should be in the body, especially at the levels we're seeing. It's clear that she was poisoned deliberately." Christina's stomach churned. She had suspected this all along, but hearing it from a medical professional made it feel more real, more horrifying. Before she could speak, Dr. Phillips added, "We're going to run more tests, but I believe we'll be able to identify exactly what was in her system soon. We'll need to inform the authorities." Christina nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the weight of the situation. She had finally gathered all the evidence she needed to prove the truth. It wasn't just about surviving the poison. It was about surviving the betrayal and coming out stronger on the other side. The events of the past few hours felt surreal to Christina, but as she sat in the sterile hospital room, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of medical staff, she realized something. This was her turning point. Her marriage, her family, her trust, all of it had been shattered, but now she had a chance to rebuild. The truth was out, and with it came the power to reclaim her life. Nina and James had plotted to poison her, to take away her career, her health, and her happiness. They thought they could silence her, make her fall apart, but Christina had fought back, first with her instincts, then with the evidence she had carefully gathered. Now, the law would take care of the rest. Christina looked at Nina, who lay unconscious on the hospital bed, her body still fighting the toxins in her system. The woman who had once seemed so kind, who had once welcomed her into the family, was now just a shell of the person she had pretended to be. Christina knew that Nina had her own demons, insecurities, jealousy, and a need to control, but that didn't excuse what she had done. And James, he had been just as complicit, using his love for her as a tool for manipulation. Christina took a deep breath, her resolve firm. The worst was over. She had taken back her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. It was time to move forward. "Thank you," she whispered to herself. It wasn't just a thank you to the universe for giving her strength. It was a thank you to herself for surviving. Now it was time to heal and to rebuild a life she could truly call her own. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved or found yourself in a toxic situation, remember, you have the power to take control. Trust your instincts, stand up for yourself, and never let anyone make you feel less than you are. If you found Christina's story relatable or if it inspired you, like, share, and comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of